Hi, Bowhead community. We're back and diving deep into the consumer protection conversations that matter as our lives evolve. In this interview, I sit down with AI and ethics advocate Pablo Naze, who recently completed a fellowship at the Institute for Gender and the Economy, based at Rotman School of Management at the University of Toronto, where he researched gender biases in artificial intelligence. I'm very happy that Tracy introduced us, and thanks to you, I've had the chance to learn more about your work since you've sent me lots of reading material. I'm just also very excited to interview you because of the times that we're currently living in. So shall we just dive into the interview?
Yes, let's do it.
Great. So I'd love for you to start by just telling me about your background and your story and what led you to your current focus of how to mitigate bias in machine learning and AI.
Thank you. Well, my name is Pablo. I'm originally from Brazil. I did my undergrad at University of São Paulo in economics. And in Brazil, I had a career in technology. I was working in venture capital, and then I joined this startup called 99, basically a ride-sharing app, so very similar to Uber. And it was a very interesting experience. I was there for 4 years. And it was the first company that reached $1 billion market value in Brazil, so the first Brazilian unicorn. And after that, we got acquired by Didi Xuxing, which is China's Uber. So it's like this giant ride-sharing app. After that, I moved to Canada to pursue my MBA at the University of Toronto at the Rotman School of Management. And when I moved to Canada, actually, I started specializing more in machine learning and AI. I did my summer internship at IBM here in Canada, working in data security and machine learning. And during the second year of my MBA, I started this fellowship at the Institute for Gender and the Economy, GATE, at Rotman, where I was diving deep into how companies might mitigate gender bias in AI. But let me tell you why I got interested in this field. Throughout my career, I've always been working with data, doing a lot of data analysis. So I always been very inclined to learn more about machine learning and AI. And actually, during one of the courses in the MBA, course about entrepreneurship and startups, we're learning about some of the examples of how AI can be biased or that is not fair to people. And that really struck my attention to see all of these clear examples of how AI can do harm. So I was interested to go to the next level and say, okay, we have all of these examples, but what can we do to fix them? How do we go from here? How do we bridge this gap between this problematic use of AI and a better use of AI for our entire society? So that was the key motivation for me to go beyond.
Thank you so much. So why is this area of focus, why is this interesting right now?
A big example right now that is on the news this week is about facial recognition and how this facial recognition software, they don't work that well for people of color. For a number of reasons. It can be biased in the data set. It can be the way that the software was made. But at the end of the day, it almost doesn't matter that much where the bias is coming from, but what companies can do about it and how can they fix that. We have IBM a couple of days ago sending a letter to Congress saying that they would stop to invest in facial recognition software. And just yesterday, we had Amazon also putting a 1-year moratorium in facial recognition software to law enforcement. And it's very interesting to see these companies taking a stand on the subject. And of course, this is not by accident. We have years of activism and studies and research on that. A big pioneer study on this is called Gender Shades. Was authored by Timney Gibru and Joy Bulamwini. And basically, this study shows that a lot of this facial recognition software, they had a lower accuracy rates, not only for women, but also for women of color and with darker skin. Because of this effort from the Black Lives Matter movement right now that we see all exposing this police brutality, we see some companies changing their views on this subject and taking this very public stance on the harms of AI.
Thank you for sharing that. It brought up a couple of thoughts. The first one being, you mentioned that the root cause doesn't really matter as long as there's an understanding that bias is taking place. So I'd love to better understand that, because if I think about it, I kind of want to understand like what is the root cause of the bias? I understand there's many potential causes. So I'd love to kind of talk about what those are. A friend of mine called performance allyship. And so I'm curious whether you actually believe in, some of these public announcements. Do you think it's an honest and authentic move?
When you have the root cause, you can go and you can think, and you can try to mitigate that, because it's really hard to claim that you are totally unbiased if you don't have bias, because we live in a biased society and we have tons of social problems. You cannot isolate a machine learning algorithm from the broader society or from the company where it's operating. So if the company knows the cause, it really helps the company to mitigate that. But also, at the end of the day, the company will have to make a decision, right? Of like, should we deploy this? Should we actually have this technology? It's not because the technology can be developed that it should be developed. So I think a lot of the movements that we're seeing companies are starting to question, should we build this? Should we deploy this? Who are the customers that are going to see this? So when you think about the Amazon announcement yesterday, they say that they're going to put a 1-year moratorium from law enforcement agencies, but they're going to still be using the technology to find missing children, for example. Which, my personal opinion, I think it's a noble motive, it's a noble reason to use facial recognition. This is a decision that Amazon, that the supplier of the softwares, they have to make, in the sense of, okay, we have this technology, but where are we going to use that? Who are going to be our clients? The second question about performative allyship, I think that's very interesting. We see this happening with companies, not only when we're talking about race and ethnicities, but think about, for example, a lot of movement that happened during the Pride Month. We see that a lot of companies change their logos into rainbows and they have all of these rainbow things, but how much money are they actually giving to LGBT organizations? How much LGBT leadership they have in their company? So it's completely comprehensible that you see all these companies position themselves in terms of, okay, we are against racism, we are anti-racist, we're doing all of these actions. But it's natural that activists are going to question these companies. How many people of color you have in your board of directors? When you think about these companies taking a stand against facial recognition, actually, Joy Buolamwini, one of the authors of Gender Shades, he had a blog post yesterday on Medium saying that this is a much welcome step from these companies. And I think it's up to the customers that are actually purchasing from these companies to think about what that means.
Yeah. No, that's a fair response. And you're right. I think the company will react when the customers react. So that's a really good point. So I'm assuming all of these learnings and insights in this domain have inspired you personally. I'm sure, now you probably can't help but feel very passionate about this area. And so I'm sure it's influenced your life. I'm curious to know how it's influenced your career trajectory, and yeah, how have you kind of academically solved for this problem?
Perfect question. For me personally, I'm much more critical about some of these AI services and some of the AI companies are doing out there. So I think before becoming more knowledgeable about the subject, I would just take for granted what the company was saying about, oh, we don't have bias in our systems, or our systems are private or secure or safe. And I think now, with all this knowledge that I developed over the past few months, I'm much more critical, and I think I'm in a position to question more some of these companies, some of the products that I'm actually purchasing, to make sure that I'm comfortable with what the company is doing with my data, and of course how they're training all of the systems. I'm really interested in continuing this work on ethical AI. I think there's an opportunity for companies to think more about this in a more structured way, not just creating those AI models and creating those algorithms and all of the systems and software, and maybe just delegating this decision to some business person that is not technical knowledgeable about the problems that might face to bias, or for example, for a technical person that might not understand some of the social consequences and some of the business impact that bias systems might have. So I believe there's an opportunity to bridge those worlds between super technical and more business side.
Wonderful. And so when we chatted earlier, you told me about this checklist that you were wanting to create for developers. When you looked into it further, you realized that it was already there and that it just wasn't being used. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, that's actually the story of the fellowship that I did with the Institute for Gendered Economy at Rotman. And as I was mentioning, I was seeing all of these examples of how AI can be biased or cannot or wasn't fair. And my idea was, okay, so how can we fix this? And my initial hypothesis was, okay, if maybe developers have a checklist that they can follow, and they can use all of these tools and mechanisms available to mitigate bias, then if they follow this checklist, then problem solved. We're not going to have any issue with that. And I was always investigating this issue when talking with developers and understanding what's out there. I realized that there were 10 or even more checklists already available since, I don't know, 2017 or 18 to build more responsible AI. But when I was interviewing some of the developers, they were aware of the issues, but they were not aware of solutions. Or even if they were, they didn't find the space in the workflows in their companies to do that. So when I was investigating further, I kind of pivot my project to understand, okay, what are some of the barriers that these developers are facing or these companies are facing? My conclusion was that it's not only a technical problem. As I was mentioning, you might have all of these techniques to mitigate bias, but at the end of the day, these models, they're not an island. They are immersed in a company culture, in a way that these teams are working. You have pressures from investors, you have pressure from clients trying to get faster models. And to mitigate for bias and to have more responsible AI, it's an investment of time, and not everyone is willing to take that. So for me, the idea was how can we mitigate gender bias in AI. It was more specific to gender, but not only from a technical perspective, but from an organizational process perspective. Through my readings and through my interviews, I developed this framework that I think might help companies to mitigate gender bias in machine learning.
Well, I'd love to hear about this framework.
Yeah, so the framework I divided in 3 steps. The first one is to understand fairness. The second one is to engage stakeholders. And the third one is to build fairness skills. So I'm going to walk you through which one of them briefly. So in terms of understanding fairness, companies and developers and business people, they need to understand that fairness is a complex subject. You have to draw from philosophy, from ethics, you have to draw from notions of justice in the law. It's going to be very contextual to your industry, to your use case. So it's not going to be a one size fits all approach. So the idea of this first step is to be very proactive in terms of understanding what fairness means for your business, for your product, for your specific situation. Without that, without this foundation, it's really hard to work beyond that. Which leads us to the second stage, which is engage stakeholders. You have, for example, business stakeholders that have pressure from investors and from clients to deliver all of these products fast. What about, for example, regulators and the legal teams in these companies? There are some anti-discrimination laws that are very specific on what fairness means. And of course, you have end users that they might feel, I don't know, used, or they might feel betrayed if the system is kind of shifting results or changing in any way that they may feel they're not being valued. And you have civil society. How can you build the story? How can you build a way forward for your company that takes all of this different conflicting interests sometimes and put it in a way that it makes sense for you and for all the stakeholders? That's a leadership. That's a leadership challenge. That's a diplomacy challenge. For me, it's not a question of choosing one versus the other and say, oh, we're going to choose business stakeholders instead of the legal team right now. But I think it's a chance to innovate and figure out where those sweet spots where everyone can agree and everyone can compromise a little bit and move forward. And then the final step for me, which is build fairness skills. You have to put processes in place. We're talking about checklists, but sometimes checklists is not something that is going to fly with the culture of your organization. Sometimes you need to be more creative in terms of how you're going to implement this and where during the pipeline of your product you're going to put that. And the final aspect of building these fairness skills, it's a really important one. It's about subject matter expertise. If you're in a bank and you're using machine learning to predict some economic model, you're going to have economists talking to you and advising you. And if you're in healthcare, you're going to have doctors and physicians advising you. So when we're talking about fairness in terms of, I don't know, gender or in terms of ethnicity, it's really important to think about philosophers, the contribution of sociologists, and the contribution of maybe historians in this whole process. It's not just about getting the developers to implement a feature, but also understand the broader aspect. There's a trap that companies may fall. It's called technical solutionism, thinking that they might solve really critical social problems just with technology. We know that it's not as simple as that. So I believe building these fairness skills are super important.
Thank you. So I wonder if you feel like right now is sort of the I guess, the golden age for, AI and ethics. We know with our company, the Cambridge Analytica case, and then also, surveillance tech, all of these kind of like dangers that became better known to the public really helped our mission in promoting data privacy, transparency, patient sovereignty. And so I'm curious to know from you, there's probably differences between a large company and a small company, like a startup. I think startups would probably need to focus more on bringing in the talent from the get-go. And that obviously requires, ethically minded leadership. And also, do you feel like this is sort of the time to really bring this education and awareness to the public and to these companies?
I think right now it's a good moment where you're getting a lot of awareness. You have some of like the literature exploded in this subject since 2017, 2018, but it's still a fairly recent subject. So everyone is still trying to understand. You can see that by the way that companies develop all these ethical AI principles. You have more than 84 principles out there, and they are converging on that. Okay, how do we go from the principles to actually doing that? And you have companies and even governments spending months and years to try to come up with the principles and forget a little bit about execution. So I think execution right now, it's one of the biggest challenges for these companies. And as you mentioned, many different barriers that have that, because when we're talking about organizational change, it takes a while, and I don't think you're ever going to get there. I think it's going to be a continued effort for these companies to do that. So I think being aware and having the leadership at least knowing what this is about, I think it's really important. But for example, startups, of course, they're trying to survive. They're trying to find customers. It's challenging to make a strong case for why a startup should be worrying about fairness if the priority is to get customers and to get the accuracy of the models right. But I don't think it has to stop there. I think there are some creative ways that startups can go around that. Especially if they acknowledge the subject, they might put further away on the roadmap, but not forget about that. Or for example, they can look for different data sets that might help them to mitigate upfront the problem. So we have some efforts from the Mozilla Foundation to develop this common data sets that are more representative and that crowdsource all over the world. So that might be a way, instead of, for example, using a data set that might be maybe easier to do, but like using another data set would just take 1 or 2 days more, maybe that would be an interesting ROI for a startup. When we're talking about bigger companies, of course, organizational change, you have to align so many people. You have to go through so much red tape. So that's why I believe having the leadership committed in big multinational companies is really important. And I think IBM, the CEO, sending a letter to Congress, it really helps the organization to align and to go forward. So I believe, of course, every company is going to be different. The framework that I developed, it might be helpful for some companies, but there are many other frameworks out there. And I think at the end of the day, the framework that you choose or how you plan to do that, it's really going to be almost custom to your company. In the same way that we're talking about how can companies implement AI in the first place. Every company is going to go for a different journey, for a different stage of their digital transformation, if you want to put it like that. So when we're talking about some ethical transformation in AI, I think it's also a process, and it's going to take time. I think it's going to take time. I don't think we're going to have fair and just system, because we have a problematic society and we have a lot of problems. So if I think to have super non-biased systems, we need to solve those problems before as a society.
Yeah. No, thank you. That was a really great answer. So I'm curious, you mentioned Mozilla, so I'm really happy to hear that. I've kind of been following their work over the last few years, and I've been very happy with what I've seen, particularly from an inclusion and diversity perspective. I'm curious to hear from you, what resources can companies use to educate themselves? And maybe if you can also bring back any of the resources you mentioned before.
Fantastic. So of course, they can read my report. There's some good resources there. Not only my report, I also have links on the report for some McKinsey materials. But of course, there are many organizations that are dedicated to help companies with that. So just to give a few examples, you have Partnership on AI. It's a consortium of nonprofits, of companies, of some government bodies that produce a lot of material that companies can educate themselves with. You have the Montreal AI Ethics Institute. It's a great institute. There are a lot of materials and resources for company to go forward. You have the Mozilla Foundation that also helps with that. And you have, for example, the AI Ethics Lab, AI Global, like so many organizations are pushing the way forward. So if you just choose one of them, you're gonna start seeing links for the other organizations, and that might be interesting. I think the caveat is it's going to change for the audience. So if you're looking for more business perspective, it's interesting to look for the Brookings reports, for the McKinsey reports. If you're looking for more like a governmental perspective, you have to look for these white papers analyzing just government principles. And if you're very technical, you have to go to these conferences. There's a really, the big conference on this is the ACM Conference for Fairness, Accountability, and Transparency. It's a big conference, so many interesting papers, very technical. So if you're a developer, more interested in that. If you're a business manager, go with McKinsey, some of the other reports. And if you're just curious, go with this broader organizations, Partnership on AI and Montreal AI Ethics Institute, because they're gonna open this entire world of AI ethics for you.
Thank you. And we'll make sure to share a link to your to the resources, and then also specifically to your work when we share this this interview. So I guess before we finish, I'd love to hear from you if you have any, final words, words of motivation or advice or caution to share with our listeners.
I would say to everyone that is interested in the subject, or maybe that is hearing this for the first time, don't be afraid. It might seem really intimidating to have all these different disciplines working together, to have law working together with computer science, to working together with philosophy and business. So don't be afraid. Just have an open mindset, open hearts and mind to understand how each discipline can contribute to this conversation. Because at the end of the day, we're discussing about fairness in society. And if you think about the democratic process, it's a lot of discussion, a lot of conversation. So just be open to learn from these disciplines. If you're a developer and you never read anything from philosophy before, maybe that's a way that you can be closer to this field. If you're a lawyer or working with law and you don't actually know how the systems work and how computers work, it might be interesting to dive a little deeper in computer science, because we need to develop this common language between computer scientists, between practitioners of law, between business people, to really push the agenda forward and move towards a more responsible AI.
Well, Pablo, thank you so much for keeping an open heart and an open mind and contributing to this very important work. It's been a pleasure to learn more about you and your work and to interview you. So thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Ray. It was my pleasure.
Thank you so much for tuning in and learning with us. We are very lucky to have Pablo on Team Ethical AI. As he said, this is just the beginning of this field. It's in its infancy, and so we can expect to learn a lot more and see a lot more action in this space over the next few years. If you like what you see, please follow along our journey. We are creating these interviews because we'd like to share diverse content in the field of consumer protection and digital health. So please follow along if you're enjoying what you're seeing. Thank you so much.